My name is Michael Goldberg, and I'm the executive director of our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve University. I'm also an associate professor at the Weatherhead School of Management, which is David's alma mater, sitting down the hall with some of your friends here, Kalle Luntinen and others who are actively involved in our Doctorate of Management program, from which David is a graduate, and Kalle was the one who made the introduction, so I appreciate that. Kalle, if you're watching. It's great to welcome David Klossner to our CWRU Entrepreneurship Alumni Speaker Series. We're thrilled that Jessica Harding, who is an undergraduate EE major here in Cleveland, but not on campus at the moment. She's doing a co-op this semester at Rockwell, and we got to know Jessica this summer. She was one of our great student participants in our remote entrepreneurship project program. So was interning with the startup and doing work in the coding and other spaces. So Jessica, it's great to see you here today. The way that we'll do this, and thanks for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, if you have a question that you want to feed to Jessica, just let her know in the chat that either you have a question, you can sort of raise your virtual or real hand, or you can put the question in the chat and Jessica can either just call on you to unmute to say it directly, or she can read it for you. And if you're watching on LinkedIn Live, you can just put your question in the comment bar and I will feed the question, or Doug DiGirolamo will, to Jessica. So with that, David, thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica.
Yeah, hi everyone. As Michael said, I'm a BSMS student in electrical engineering here at Case, and I'm super excited to talk with David Klossner today about his experience in manufacturing startups. So, David, if you're there, if we want to get started, you could give us like a brief overview of your career.
Yeah, let's get started. So, I'm 60 years old. I went to mechanical engineering school, and I also have a degree in finance and marketing from an MBA from Northern University, Illinois. And then received a PhD in sustainable business practices from Case in 2014. That's the educational background for the most part. From a career perspective, started out in engineering, got into sales, and then got into sales management, and then I'd say in the early 90s, started becoming financially responsible for companies, general manager or president, and my last couple jobs has been president and CEO of different companies. And really fortunate that others have been the outcome has been positive. So yeah, so that's a brief overview. Also in the Marine Corps, I'm a pilot, and that's pretty much covered.
Yeah, so right now you're president of KDA Manufacturing. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so KDA is the initials of my three kids, one of which is Kendra, Dylan, and Audrey. And it's my wife and I who have started this business. And it was a greenfield startup, meaning that it was from zero. So it wasn't a brownfield or an existing operation. So we built our facility, and we did it in a manner that which sort of aligns with my education at Case. It was a green facility, a LEED compliant and European Daylight Standard compliant facility. It's beautiful. I like it. It's what I liked. And we started this business from zero. So we hired employees and we seeked customers and started that. And that our first order was shipped in July of 2017. And prior to that, we got our occupancy to our building in January of 2017. And it's basically been a everyday sprint to grow this business. We've been negatively impacted by COVID, and we can talk about that a little bit later. What we focus on, what if you have the one or two sentence elevator speech of what is KDA? We're a heavy manufacturer, so we take steel components mostly. We do stainless and other alloys, but for the most part, we take steel. We weld on it, we cut it, we form it, and then we machine it, and then we assemble it. And then because most of the time what we're doing is fairly large, we get involved with painting it and shipping it. In fact, we had a super load coming out of Cleveland the first of the year, which was 23 feet in width. And it was basically 5 escorts, so it's right up our alley. And that's sort of like what we do.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how, like, with a startup, how do you identify gaps in the market to target?
Yeah, Jessica, that's a great question. So a lot of times identifying market opportunities is luck. It's a lot of hard work, and it's also trying to anticipate what you believe could be a trend. So for KDA, I felt as though there was an opportunity for manufacturers to reshore some of the manufacturing that they have taken offshore to, like China and other countries. So I thought that was a market in this area, a market opportunity for this area. And that was vetted a couple times a few years before we started the company. And if you look at, Ohio is in the middle of the Rust Belt. If you look at the Rust Belt chronological history of it, a lot of that business has moved out, and I felt like there was an opportunity for some of that to move back. And I think that this pandemic may have heightened that with, it's important for us to be able to make things as simple as respirators and chemicals for vaccines and other things. So it's looking at what opportunities that others may not serve at that particular point.
And speaking of COVID, could you speak a little bit about how you guys have tried to adapt to the pandemic with its ever-pervasive effects?
Yeah, so the pandemic has been devastating to KDA. It's been one of the challenges. And when you look at entrepreneurial mindset, you must be prepared and overcome challenges and setbacks. In this pandemic, if you read the news, of course, and you listen to companies like Boeing and others, it's a huge, significant setback. So it's negatively affected KDA significantly. So we've adjusted our workforce, and now we've been spending an enormous amount of time trying to create a positive cash flow. And that's been our priority. And we've looked at many different opportunities, and right now I don't necessarily have the perfect answer, but we do have some plans in place that will help us to survive, because once we do survive, I do believe, albeit our economy will come back gradually, it will eventually come back and succeed what it was before the pandemic.
So as you've started a few startups now, could you speak a little bit on the key traits and skills that you think you need to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so KDA is my 5th startup. The 4th one was in India, the 3rd one was in Budapest, and then we did a startup here in Ohio, and then one in Chicago. So, doing a startup is, you have to have a vision of sort of like what you believe the desired outcome is going to be. And you need to be able to see that outcome in your mind's eye. And that's sort of your guiding light. And and I visit that mindset, that what I'd hoped our desired outcome was going to be. And so you need to have a plan of what you hope to achieve. You need to be able to overcome challenging situations, that's for sure. Skills, expanding your skill set, continuously sharpening the saw, and understanding what you're doing. I mean, the internet is such a phenomenal tool, and it's pretty much, during the week, I work on dealing with all the situations that we have at KDA, and basically Saturday and Sunday, I spend most of the day just researching different aspects of what KDA is going to be involved with, opportunities. So it's expanding your skill sets, continuously sharpening the saw, and then problems. You're going to be faced with problems. It's just the way it is. As soon as you do something, as soon as you ship that first product, as soon as you hire that first employee, as soon as you start that first machine, as soon as you break the ground to erect the building, you're going to have problems. And you got to be able to overcome those problems. And it helps to be able to overcome those problems if you try to approach them at times from a different context. So, this is what I believe the immediate approach is to this problem, but there may be another idea, or there may be another approach, or there may be a whole different way that problem wouldn't even be there if you looked at a different opportunity. And then I think the last two things are energy and effort, and just I guess I call it value added motion. Just work and try to be valuable of what you to the outcome of what you were hoping to achieve. So just being a hard worker is important, and value added motion. I would say those were the key skills that I think that entrepreneurs need. And I think it applies not only to people that make things like KDA, but there's a lot of other entrepreneurs that provide value in services. So what they make is a service. So I think that same skill set applies to that as well.
Can you think of some time in your career where one or all of these skills have particularly come in handy?
Well, yeah, I mean, when we started KDA, I'll just tell you a couple stories. We started KDA, we bought a parcel of land not too far from here. We went through all the research of the land. We pulled all the permits. We did everything that was ready to go. We had our contract in place. And a day before close, the guy that I was buying the land from said, "I don't want to sell it." And it's like, that was a problem. It was a lot of effort, and it, basically, what do? You can't immediately force the guy to sell, because there's laws in place against that kind of action. But so we had to start over, and that cost us approximately 9 months of a lot of effort to basically find a new parcel of the land and start over. And it happened to be in a different county, so we had to pull permits. We had to go through zoning. We had to go through variances. We had to have town hall meetings, and and it's like that's a time where you have to be able to overcome, and you just can't give up. So that would be one example of KDA. There's other examples that overcome what I thought were challenging situations that, again, if you're going to be an entrepreneurial person with that mindset, you be prepared to overcome challenges.
Yeah, so we could backtrack a little bit. I know you mentioned that some of your startups were in other countries, and I was wondering if you could speak on the differences between what it is to have a startup here in Ohio versus, I believe you said Budapest, right?
Yeah. So this building is the exact same building we built in India, we built in Budapest, and it's very similar to the buildings that we built in Chicago and Medina, Ohio. So I started with the building because what part of our strategy is to build big things. I like making big things. It's just, it's interesting to me. So when you make big things, you have to have the facility to be able to get those things in and out of the building. You have to be able to lift them up. And so typically you don't find the type of building that you need waiting out there because of the size and height and door openings and power. So you usually start with the building once you've identified the market opportunity. So in India, we identified basically I visited every city of any size and determined what climate, what employment skills that were available, infrastructure opportunities, what was going to be easy for me to get in and out of there type of thing as far as flights. And so we chose outside of Bangalore. And so we started the building process. And that, that was a little tricky because the quality standards for building components is not the same. So we had some issues there. So you have to be careful. When you're lifting a lot of weight with overhead cranes, you got to make sure your components are built to a certain standard. So you have to establish quality requirements for your operation because you don't want a building that's going to fall down. And then hiring people was, I would say, was the next challenge in India. And unlike the United States, there was a surplus of people. Finding employees wasn't difficult. We could find many employees, and so we went through a very elaborate screening process. And once we found a dozen or so welders and a dozen or so engineers, we brought them to the United States and started training them in our standards here. And that was a little interesting. And then once the business once we got the employees in place and we started installing our equipment, a lot of the same challenges you have for starting a business from scratch are the same. So we had to find out which employees were going to get on the bandwagon, so to speak, and what skill sets we had, and what opportunities we could leverage off based on those skill sets that we found. And that business, fortunately, took off, and it serviced not only the emerging economy requirements for power in India, but it also was able to provide components elsewhere in the world at a very economical price. So I would say a lot of the similarities are the same. You always have the travel issues, and India is there's challenges in India just getting around and being able to drink and eat without getting sick. That's a challenge there. And we work through all that. Our facility, one or two differences, our facility in India, because of the challenges of making sure we controlled our water supply and our food supply, we built our own offices and apartments at that facility, and we made sure we had a very secure water supply, reverse osmosis, chemical treatment, and all that other stuff. So I felt like we could have a lot of our employees from the States go there and not become ill, because that turned out to be a very much of a challenge. So,
how was your process of interview different in India than it was in the United States?
Well, Karen, the interviewing process was very similar. Most of the people in India who would be interested in these kind of jobs with this kind of a multinational company speak English. So communication from that perspective wasn't really that hard. Understanding what their skill sets were and how it related to what we required, that took a little bit of a time, but when we brought the welders and the engineers to Ohio, and they basically were here for about 9 months, we worked through that. And I would say these guys, Indians, as a rule, are very proud people, and they want to do right. And so the engineers and the welders, these guys became very skilled, we had certified welders, and they became extremely gifted at those skills, as well as the engineers.
So I actually had noticed, but James asked a question in the chat. James, if you want to unmute and ask it yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David. I was curious, when you kind of thought about becoming an entrepreneur, there's the buy versus build decision. You've taken the startup way of kind of building your own companies. And our beloved Gorilla kind of taught, that's one of the ways. Also, buying a company can be a way of ameliorating the early risks of failure for new businesses. So I just wondered what your calculus was on that and how you arrived at this decision and your thoughts on that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, James. So I've been involved with basically all 3 different types of building expansions, market business expansions. The greenfield, as we're talking about now, the acquisition side, and then the brownfield, where basically you're buying an operation. It may not be what exactly you want to do with that operation, but there's something that's already there in place, and you're going to take that existing either business model or facility and move it into a different direction. So the acquisition side of the business expansion, in many ways, it's a lot easier than a greenfield. You have leverage in many. You have employees that have established habits that in a greenfield you have nothing. I mean, when we were installing our equipment and we didn't have all our concrete floors in already. So, and that's difficult to hire certain people, because they walk in and they say, well, you don't have a floor. How do you, and it's like, well, yeah, I'll have a floor in here in a couple of weeks. So from an employee perspective, acquisitions and brownfields are significantly easier because they've established themselves. That as a rule, humans are creatures of habit. So they're going to the same place, and they're typically going to hang in there with you for a while. Until you can get them to understand what your strategy is. So I would say the human side of it is much easier with an acquisition or brownfield. And then, of course, a lot of times, that saying, it is much easier to review than it is to do. And what I mean by that is, I've turned around several businesses that were losing on an annual basis millions of dollars, and that is much easier than a greenfield, because you can walk in, and because your perspective on it is it's not twisted by whatever you've been living there, and so you're able to see things that are broken fairly quickly, make changes, and so from that perspective, it's much easier. So I tried the acquisition. Before we started KDA, I was involved with about a dozen due diligence. And we made offers on 4 or 5 of those companies, and they either fell out because of environmental concerns, legacy concerns with their facility from an environmental perspective. Their financials were a little bit overstated, so there was that perspective. Or typically, you're dealing, at least at the level that I was involved with, you're dealing with an entrepreneur that, when you start a business, that's your baby. My wife and I have talked that, we've had 4 kids. We've been blessed with 3 beautiful, healthy kids, and KDA's are 4. So, from that perspective, it's, the entrepreneur, sometimes, even though they may think they want to sell it, they don't at the very last minute because it's their kid. It's their baby.
So David, I can't help but joking, since 2 of your kids are on, when you were saying that you had 3 beautiful kids, I was like, I hope he's not going to say that one of his kids on this call is not beautiful. So I'm glad that you said KDA was your 4th. I was getting a little worried.
Yeah, and Michael, actually, all 3 of my kids are on. Kendra is my.
Oh, funny. Okay, I didn't pick that the last name. How funny. Okay, even more relieved now that all 3 are on that you didn't say any of them were not.
Well, and I actually have 4 on because I consider Bill, her husband, one of the family. So we have all 4 of our kids on. Okay.
So this actually feels like a great segue to go into a question that Michael asked, which was, how has it been different starting a company with your family members versus business partners?
I only put it in the chat. That was a plant from Audrey, so I was just sharing it, not from me. I have to give credit where credit is due.
Well, I am probably one of the most luckiest guys you're ever going to find because I have a beautiful wife, and she is just a really good person. And we have learned how to work together, and that has been a challenge at times. As a rule, my personality is intense. When I'm at work, I work. There's no playing around. It's very intense. When your wife walks into your office and says something that is not necessarily what you're interested in, you must be able to handle that situation in a manner that doesn't get her mad at you. And that is, that's been hard for me. I think I've learned how to do it, and I also think she's also learned that, just how I am at work. But it's also been a real blessing because I like looking at her. I find her very attractive, so that's nice. So during the day, I can just walk out my door and see this person that I really love, and that's nice. And she's kind to me during the day, which typically when you're president and CEO, that doesn't happen. So. And she has, on certain aspects of the business that, frankly, she handles all our payroll, handles all the IT, all structural requirements. She's been involved with our ISO registration. We're an ASME pressure vessel shop. She did all that work. She's involved, we're partnering with OSHA. We're trying to achieve this SHARP certificate. She's done all that. So I'm blessed to have that. And I think now, going forward, I don't want it any other way. So it's a good thing.
That was really sweet.
Yeah.
If we want, I think Dylan actually has a question on your environmental practices. Dylan?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I was hoping that Michael would also ask and say this is a plant too, but that's okay. David, I think everyone is probably very interested in hearing about some of the big details and the small details when it comes to the plant that you built in Norton, specifically with regards to sort of the environmental friendly things and innovations that you've added during the construction process.
Yeah, good question. So, the environmental approach that we took to this building started from the ground up. So we went out and sought and found basically recycled bricks and stone. So the foundation of all our drives and the pad inside the building, that was recycled. Prior to that, or during all that construction, I drove around Northeast Ohio looking for bridges, overpass bridges on the major highways that were being torn down. And we were fortunate to find a bridge on I-70 going into Wheeling, West Virginia. We basically bought the bridge and we trucked the bridge here. And so and this is not an exaggeration, every structural member of our building was the I-70 bridge going into Wheeling, West Virginia. Part of our building, the exterior panels came from a FedEx facility in New Hampshire. And just that's basically one component of that LEED compliant certificate we were chasing. Our windows, we bought our windows. All our windows were slated for the aquarium in Atlanta, and they were just about ready to all be destroyed. But we bought them from the window distributor. They turned out that they shouldn't have the UV film that typically everybody wants in their windows, because they don't want the UV to be blocked for the aquarium, because the animals, that's not what they wanted. So, a huge portion of our building is from recycled components. So that's the biggest part. In fact, we're doing that again. We just bought basically a third of the bridge here in Barberton, Ohio on Wooster Road and I-76, and we're looking at building our next facility. Went with extra heavy insulation in the roof and wall, including our doors, which is unusual. We have all LED lights. Every light in the they're all on motion. We don't have a switch in the plant, so everything's based on motion. So there'll be times that the plant will be dark in a certain area when there's no activity going on. We went with a geothermal heat pump system. In fact, Dylan and Bill Bergen were instrumental in wrapping the coils as we buried them in the ground. So that's just to name a few things that that we implemented, and not all that was economically. We could have done a few things probably a little bit more economical if we'd have chosen to go new. But I also think that the product that we got at the end of the day turned out to be just what I was hoping for. And we were blessed to be written up in one of the local newspapers, green manufacturing or green plant boost in order. So, and it's I don't know, I like doing it that way.
Yeah. So besides your environmental choices for sustainability through manufacturing, which I think is really cool, can you speak to some other KDA's accomplishments that you're proud of?
Well, yeah. So we had anticipated, whenever you start a business, especially a greenfield, you have to have that first money up front to put to buy the capital, to buy the capital expenditures for building equipment and all that stuff. And then you have to have operational capital to fund your payroll, because at the beginning you have to have people here before you have sales. So our goal was to be cash flow neutral or positive within 3 years. And in the past, when I've started an operation 3 years on a manufacturing from a cash flow perspective, hitting cash flow neutral or cash flow positive in 3 years. In 3 years for a manufacturer, that's pretty good. What I was proud of is KDA did it in 2, which was a lot of work. So We became profitable in the middle of 2019, right at 2 years. That's something to be proud of. Our facility is, it's been recognized by many. We've had a lot of interest in our facility, so I'm pleased with that. And you know what? We've got some good employees. Guys that care. And some of the equipment we've installed, and we installed all of our equipment ourselves. It's big, so I'm proud of the equipment that we've installed and how quickly we were able to get it to contribute. So I would say those were the key things. I mean, if you look at startups as a rule, you're going to see that a significant portion, like 90% of them, fail. So it's I don't feel like we have a challenge with this pandemic, but we were achieving that prosperous side, that's also a nice accomplishment.
So it looks like Brian also has a question. Brian, if you want to unmute and ask it.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Klossner, for your story. I guess I'll just read what I wrote. Is that not that long ago, the banking community was like literally abandoning smaller firms such as yours. I mean, of course, the crisis of 8 and 9. If you talk to any smaller folks in manufacturing in that period, they remember the day their bank called them and shut their revolver. And this would intrigue me about this. Your presentation is this idea of a manufacturing startup, which, like I say, startup and manufacturing don't often go together, at least in my experience. So I'm just kind of wondering, how do you undertake this endeavor, which is complicated enough as it is, right? The startup a greenfield operation, when there's not a lot of people jumping on your bandwagon. I would imagine. I have imagined you incur some skepticism and people who are not buying into your vision readily.
Well, Brian, you're 100% correct. Banks will run away from you if you say the word startup. They're not designed to service startups, and it's not all the bank's fault. A lot of them have certain regulations that are difficult to meet for a startup. But I would say the vast majority of the reason why banks are not startup friendly is because they're so risk averse. And so, I've always said, and my kids have heard this probably 100 times, banks will only loan you money when you don't need it. So a startup is, that's tough. And you hit it right on the head. And 99% of the people don't realize how much of a fight it is to do a greenfield just from the funding perspective. So, I could tell you a quick story about KDA. We were fortunate enough, we had enough capital to get the building erected. And once we got the building erected, not necessarily move in state, but erected. We didn't really have the doors in, we didn't have any roads in, we didn't have any floor in, we didn't have any lights, electrical, we had nothing but the building erected. Then a banker can come up here and he can see something. And then, so we funded our project ourselves with our own capital just to get the building erected. And then banks go crazy on cash flow. I mean, cash flow. So you have to be able to generate cash. And, a lot of times as a startup, you don't generate cash for the first few years, and that scares bankers. So, and I would say, based on what we've recently experienced with the pandemic, we have exhausted pretty much every other opportunity for refinancing, including the SBA. The SBA is, they also have some pretty significant guidelines on what they can do and what they can't do. And, startups are somewhat difficult for them. But, they do some startups, but Brian, you also were wise that you don't see very many manufacturing startups, greenfields, in North America anymore, and that's a sort of sad. And I hope that somehow we can maybe change that, at least from the SBA, the Small Business Administrative perspective, to help nurture that environmental or that manufacturing entrepreneurial spirit. So I hope I answered your question, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. You did, and and I can't imagine venture capital is lining up at your door either. Maybe they are, but that's not my space. I'm a shop rat myself, so I don't, I'm not so well versed in those things. But I would say also I have some experience in family business, and that's probably your greatest asset right there, I would imagine. Hearing you speak, perhaps only a family could get through this sort of process.
Yeah, so the venture capital guys, your private equity guys, all those guys, they're not too interested in greenfields because of the cash flow thing. I mean, those guys live on cash flow. And a lot of times what their concept is, and I don't necessarily, and I believe they bring value to many situations, but a lot of times their goal is to buy, flip, and buy and turn, buy and flip the business. And what they're looking for is, and this is why they're doing it, is to generate value to themselves or some of the people that have invested. So they're always looking, once they do an acquisition, what's their exit strategy. So, and that's not all for all of them, but a vast majority of them. Now there's some that have started out saying they're a little bit different, but so venture capitalists, private equity guys, and typically they're expensive. They're running, it's not uncommon for them to be at 10%, and they want a lion's share of the pie. So so financing a greenfield, and I would highly recommend that anybody who takes on a manufacturing greenfield, that they really need to think about how they're going to finance this thing for at least 3 months on a cash flow basis. Or not 3 months, 3 years, pardon me, 3 years on a cash flow basis.
Thank you.
So I was hoping to backtrack a little bit. What got you interested in kind of pursuing startups and going into the entrepreneurial space in the first place?
Well, I like making things. So, it's either making a business or expanding a business, or taking that business and making it better. The business we had in Chicago when I got there, it was very limited on what they did. And so, we expanded. We got into bigger and better, I thought, better things. And that business has continuously prospered and done well. So it's making things better. That's just, I guess, the bottom line. So, Jessica, I hope I answered that question. Just looking at a situation and say, well, you've got a huge asset with these people, your employees, and they've got skills that can be transferred to maybe other products that currently there's not a lot of people in that space. So why don't we try that? And that's worked out well for me in several situations.
And then it looks like we might be running out of time. So this will be the last question, unless anyone puts something in the chat pretty soon. But I was wondering if you had any advice for young entrepreneurs, what are some of the biggest takeaways of your career?
Well, I think that creating something that has basically not existed prior to you being involved is really, it's just cool. It's just like, at the end of the day, it's just really fun. It's a lot of work, but it's fun. And you think about, some of the people that I've have been fortunate enough to hire, and how they prospered and how they've just grown. It's just creating opportunities for others. Is really sort of fun too. In a lot of ways, there's some analogies, many analogies between, you decide to have a child. Well, that's a lot of work. And if you do it right, you're going to make a heck of a commitment. You're going to sacrifice some of the hobbies that you had and the things that you did prior to having a child. And then you're really going to make that a project. And you're going to spend all this time trying to nurture this being. Well, that's the same thing as a business. You're going to try to nurture this thing, to grow it and to get it bigger and better, and have it do this and that and other things that gives it more opportunities and gives it more ways to grow in different scenarios instead of just one. There's that. It's very similar to that. And then when you see that child grow to walking, and then and become a young adult, and watch that child go out and have their own family, and it's like, wow, that's cool. And so that's sort of like a business. Like the business we had in Ohio, it was negatively affected by the economy downturn in 2009. So we sort of stuck our head up and said, okay, yeah, the economy in North America is sort of soft, so what should we do? Let's go build a facility in India, and let's go buy a company up in Canada, and let's go do something over in Eastern Europe, because those guys need power. So it's trying to find things to do that are value added.
Wow, that's a great answer. Thank you so much for your time, David. And I'm going to throw it back to you, Michael.
Great. And Jessica, thank you for moderating. One of the real pleasures of this series is seeing students like Jessica sort of step into the moderating role. We saw how challenging moderating can be on the national stage this week. So seeing our students, future Chris Wallace here, cutting their moderating chops in our speaker series is always great. David, thank you for joining. I think your sharing the story, and I think as Brian had mentioned, we don't have a lot of speakers in our speaker series that are doing things in the manufacturing space, and hearing the journey, and it's as much of a startup as anything else. And I think, as James was mentioning, some of the lessons even from professors like Richard Osborne, who taught here, and working with folks who are sort of looking at sort of building or acquiring businesses in sort of more traditional spaces, is something, or stories that are important to share. I also would say, as a parent of 3 kids, a son and 2 daughters, it's awesome seeing your kids grown and working and being part of today's session. My kids are all in high school, so I'm hoping someday they'll be back joining me in some session. So Dylan, Audrey, and Kendra, thank you so much for joining with your dad today. And David, thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, this was enjoyable. Jessica, you did a phenomenal job. Every interaction I've had with you has been positive. I think that. Thank you. And thanks for the question. You don't really prepare for something like this, and I thought it was easy. So thank you.